Hello, I'm John Robinson and this is Samples to Symphonies. The solo violin is one of the most expressive instruments, from the exuberance of the hornpipe to a more plaintive melody like this one. Today we'll emulate both of these on Musesounds to assess how expressive a notation program can be. The YouTube channel that's taught me most about composing and arranging in a digital audio workstation is Jono Buchanan's. When I started to use orchestral samples, I worked through Jono's videos on orchestration, accessible as a playlist on his channel. The first, I'll include a link in the description below, is about playing a violin line, then automating the movement of the parameters modulation, expression, legato and vibrato. The musical phrase Jono improvised for that video and the steps he went through are a great framework for illustrating the difference between using orchestral samples in a DAW and using them in a notation program like Musescore. Let's first watch Jono inputting the notes. The sound you'll hear is that of violins from the BBC Symphony Orchestra sample library. Jono applied some light quantization to move the note start times closer to the beats and produced this. The recorded notes are represented as a piano roll, showing by height the pitches and by horizontal length the note durations. Before we go further, a few words about musical expression. When you're playing a real instrument, there are many ways you can be expressive. Some are subtle and to do with the particular instrument, but there are two biggies. The first is the way you change the sound of your instrument by bowing, blowing or hitting it harder. It gets louder and its tone or timbre changes too. Some instruments, including many electronic ones, keep the timbre constant with changed loudness. Maybe you're just moving a volume pedal up and down, but for almost all orchestral instruments, tone changes with loudness. We call words like piano, forte, crescendo, diminuendo dynamics, because even though they're instructions for loudness, they are accomplished by the dynamic force you apply to bowing, blowing or hitting. Most electronic keyboards provide a modulation wheel or slider, and there's a MIDI channel that carries that data. For virtual instruments that you bow or blow, the modulation wheel and channel is effectively a dynamics wheel. It changes the loudness and tone of the instrument as if a real instrument were being bowed or blown. Instruments that you hit are controlled by key velocity, but we're considering a string line, so we'll ignore that for today. MIDI also has a channel called expression, which is simply a volume control. It allows you to change the loudness without changing the timbre. When people enter orchestral lines into a DAW, you often see them controlling modulation and expression with two sliders, and typically they move similarly. In Jono's video though, he actually draws in the modulation and expression after the fact, then replays the tune to demonstrate the effect. Something we'll see in just a moment, once I've introduced the second biggie of musical expression. If you're a soloist or the conductor, you can control the timing. It's up to you to interpret the tempo marks on the score. You might add variations in tempo, rubato, and you might deliberately or accidentally be imprecise in the onset and length of each particular note. DAWs give you fine control of timing, including when notes are played so smoothly one after the other, called legato, that the transitions become smeared and one note might glide into the next. The quantization I mentioned earlier is an example of moving note start times to be closer to the beats, and there'll be more about legato later. But back to Jono as he considers dynamics.
So at the moment, expression isn't doing anything. All of the shape of this is coming from this modulation line.
Jono made a few further tweaks to end up with this up and down trajectory of modulation. Now I've added his expression curve to the bottom of the same picture. Remember, expression is just volume, so Jono is giving a slight volume boost to some of the places where the modulation is high. There's actually a third loudness controlling signal that you can see as a faint green line behind the modulation and expression trails. That's the key velocities from when Jono played in the notes. Now, key velocities only control loudness for instruments that are hit, not for those that are bowed or blown, which leaves them available to be used for something else, like control legato, which is something you can do with precision using the BBC Symphony Orchestra sample library, though the mechanism perhaps isn't that intuitive.
Now, glissando is a particular performance technique which basically allows a note to swoop from one note to another. Do we just want the note to step perfectly, or do we want to just smudge it with a little bit of a swoop? And at low velocities, we get longer glissando times. I'll show you what I mean. If I come back to the velocity information on this particular line, what I have a chance to do is to see that there are different velocities that are playing all the way through. But if I get into low velocities, what's going to happen is that a one note giving way to the next is going to make it swoop, whereas more mid velocities aren't going to do any of that at all. So let's suppose what I wanted to do was to have this note gently glissando into this note. So instead of this very delineated line that I've got at the moment, what I want instead is for this note to just swoop down from here down to here. So what I'm doing is I'm taking this note and I'm turning its velocity right down to something really low, 7 in fact. So let's have a listen to this. Okay, now to hear that more clearly, let's take the previous note where we've got more of a step. Now this is only going to work if the notes overlap, which they do because we've done that with forced legato. So what we should hear now is this slightly yearning sense of this note bending up to this one. Sure enough, you can hear how it just bends. Now we've got a little bit of that happening.
After more adjustments, Jono comes up with this profile of key velocities to control legato. Finally, Jono discusses vibrato. Again, that can be adjusted with precision in the BBC Symphony Orchestra sample library. Jono creates a profile so the longer notes get the most vibrato, but there are subtleties throughout. Now I'm going to demonstrate how I tried to reproduce as closely as possible Jono's string line in Musescore. You will see me opening up a new score and choosing a string quartet as the appropriate format for me to easily enter a violin part. Once open, we change to continuous mode view, which is going to be easier for playback, and then do some initialization. Start by selecting classic phrasing, which I don't know why it isn't default in Musesounds. Then set up the key signature, it's C minor. So we want a beat of about 90 per minute, and I'm going to just type in quarter notes or crotchets because that's more convenient. So we'll have cut common time. And we're ready to go. I'm going to use a mode of Musescore that allows you to input notes to a click track. It's very mechanical. You'll hear how mechanical as I begin to follow the clicks and hold notes down just long enough for them to enter into the score. This is not at all musical, but if you know the phrase that you're going for, then it's probably the quickest way to enter music. You'll see I added an extra note at the beginning just so I didn't have to switch to a rest format. Now at the end I turn off note addition mode and go back and deal with that first note, which should be a rest, as well as let's shorten some of the longer notes. Okay, so next to add some dynamics markings. This has to serve as the equivalent of both the modulation and the expression wheels. So you see I'm picking from the menu standard dynamics marks to correspond as closely as possible to Jono's choices for the dynamics. There's no extra way of boosting volume. We're just going to rely on these few coarse levels PPP, PP, MP, MF, F, FF, FFF, rather than the 128 levels that modulation and expression give you. Having done that, let's add in the crescendos and diminuendos. With the second bar, I have to manipulate the hairpins to get them in the right places. So we want a crescendo following the initial onset of this note, then a diminuendo down. In the overlaid window, you can see the phrase and the modulation and expression trajectories from Jono's work that we're trying to approximate. Jono made these long notes swell a little in volume after they started, so that's why I've tried to achieve the same rise in volume and then the fall again with the hairpins. Now the volume stays pretty well constant over the next little while, then at the end it has to decline to MF, back to F, then over 2 bars it's going to go down to quiet. Now, in fact, Jono had a curved trajectory taking the dynamics down. So let's go first to MF, that's 1 step down, and then 2 steps down to P. The next step is to interpret the legato parts of Jono's phrase in terms of slurs, in terms of phrase marks. I don't think the phrasing is particularly natural for this motif, but what I'm trying to do so far as possible is to represent the places where Jono went for maximum legato. Okay, the final thing is vibrato. Now, really, it's just a choice of vibrato on or off in Musesounds, so nothing like the subtlety of the control that Jono was using. Judging by his profile, I think that we need to add in vibrato off and on marks here and here, and we can have a listen. Okay, well, there's one thing we can do more. This is just a solo violin. So why don't I copy this line to the second stave, copy, paste, and now I'll open up the mixer, and in the instrument for the second line, I'll replace my single violin with a violin section. so that now I have a solo violinist and a violin section playing together, and this will be the final Musesounds equivalent. So how does Musesounds notation-based rendition compare with the nuanced DAW performance? The answer partly depends on your preference between the tone of the free Musesounds violin and violins or the BBC Symphony Orchestra violins. But in terms of the dynamics, the notation program has far fewer levels of loudness and therefore tone than the modulation wheel-controlled dynamics of the DAW. The notation program doesn't have an additional means of controlling volume as the DAW does with the expression channel, but then nor does a violinist have any way to play louder other than by bowing harder. The control of legato offered by the BBC Symphony Orchestra sample library in a DAW is certainly comprehensive and detailed, but it's non-intuitive too. Meanwhile, I think that Musesounds have done a pretty good job of implementing classic phrasing as a way to get legato where you want, even though it's either on or off. Now, vibrato. Jono put most vibrato a little way into long notes, and that's where Musesounds automatically puts it. So in terms of placement, the match was quite good. But with only off or on, Musesounds vibrato is always heavy. And that lack of subtlety is, to me, the biggest difference between the two renditions. Let's listen to both one last time.
And what's so wonderful about orchestral programming is that if what I was now going to do was to program a sort of cello line to sort of provide a supporting bottom end to this, if I was to apply the same rationale to the way that I wanted the shape of those notes to unfold in support of this first line, effectively the authenticity that we're bringing to the performance of these samples would kind of almost double. It becomes greater than the sum of its parts. Because those two lines would be independent of each other and I'd make slightly different choices based on the specifics of those individual bits of data, what we'd end up with is a really lush, rich musical performance.
Multiple instruments with different dynamics and articulations. Maybe I could make a video about that too. Stay tuned. In the meantime, thank you for watching and listening.